Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for participating in today's ASBMR Advocacy Update webinar. I am Patricia Ducy, and I'm the chair of the ASBMR Advocacy and Science Policy Committee, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Before we get started, I have two quick announcements. During this webinar, all participants will be in listen-only mode. And if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit your question. And all your questions will be answered at the end of the presentations. And also today's presentation is recorded and it will be available on the ASBMR YouTube page. It is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. First panelist is Jennifer Zeitzer, and she is the Director of Public Affairs at FASEB, a very seasoned advocate, and she knows everything going on in DC. And our second panelist is Anna Miller from our own Smith-Berkley ASBMR Help, and she's the Operations Coordinator at ASBMR. And today's agenda will begin with Mrs. Zeitzer, congressional update on NIH funding for 2022 and hopefully beyond. And she will also discuss President Biden's new DARPAH program, which plans for a $6.5 billion over 3 years to fund high-risk, high-reward research programs. Then Ms. Anna Miller will give us a brief update on our own current hope for a Dexa legislation in Congress. And she will discuss how you and the friends you are talking with can be more proactive in advocating for ASBMR efforts. And finally, as I mentioned before, we will end the webinar by answering your questions. It is now my sincere pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Jennifer Zeitzer. Jennifer.
Thank you, Dr. Ducy, for that generous introduction. And it's great to be here with everybody from ASBMR. As a very active member of FASEB, we really do enjoy a partnership with all of you. So I want to compliment ASBMR on the timing of this webinar. It's actually coming at a great time because both the House and Senate are on a break this week. So it's a really good opportunity to sit back and take stock of where things stand and what the future looks like for the next couple of months. So next slide, please. So ASBMR asked me to kind of give you a lay of the land. What's the environment on Capitol Hill? And if you've been watching the news or Twitter or any pretty such social media, you're probably getting a somewhat negative viewpoint of how things are going these days. You know, what we've seen is just what I refer to as massive legislative gridlock throughout the early summer and fall. It was really hard to take a look at what was happening on Capitol Hill and say, wow, things are going great, because they weren't. What you saw was a lot of infighting among the House and Senate Democrats, and unfortunately, that was on display in the media, in press conferences, in tweets going back and forth with each other, and it was hard to escape that. At the same time, it was pretty obvious that Republicans were blocking movement on some of the key bills in the Senate, and in fact, a couple Democrats, whose names will not be mentioned here, were doing the same thing. So things were not looking great. But I am a glass half full kind of girl, and we are starting to finally see, after months and months of fighting, some breakthroughs. And the first big breakthrough actually took place last week, and we're starting to see the momentum pick up. That infrastructure bill that you've probably been hearing a lot about was finally approved by the House. It had been approved by the Senate in August and then kind of sat out there in limbo. That bill is headed to President Biden's desk for a signature next week. And so right now, everybody's just kind of breathing a sigh of relief that they got it done. That being said, that's one of two major pieces of legislation that have really sucked all the oxygen out of the room on Capitol Hill for months. And that second piece is what you probably have been hearing referred to as the reconciliation or social spending bill. That is another huge package that looks like it may find its way to some sort of victory in a couple of weeks. So where things stand is the House has committed to vote on this reconciliation bill in whatever form it emerges from, because they're still writing it, the week of November 15th. What they're waiting on is some information about how much that bill will cost. The Senate has said if the House can pass that bill, they're going on the week of the 15th, they will strive to vote on it by Thanksgiving as well too. So it's a sort of good news, bad news scenario, in that the good news is things are moving forward. The bad news is it sounds like it's going to take a few more weeks for that to work out. So the impact and how that impacts folks at ASBMR and the research community is, unfortunately, it means that all the work on the fiscal year 2022 budget has been put on hold. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what do I mean by being put on hold. So it's really made it hard for anyone on Capitol Hill to talk about anything other than infrastructure and reconciliation. In addition, there was another event last week that's proved to be a bit of a distraction, and that is elections. So we obviously have the midterm congressional elections next November, so pretty much a little bit over a year, actually about a year from now. Those were already a big distraction in terms of what people are thinking politically. And then obviously what happened last week in Virginia and New Jersey and those governor's races and a couple of the other what we call off-year elections is having a real impact on everybody's thinking on Capitol Hill. What does it mean? Are the Democrats in trouble? The Republicans going to take over? And it's really hard to make bipartisan progress in that environment when everybody's thinking about a year ahead, what's going to happen. Next slide, please. So where does that leave things in terms of the status of funding for the federal agencies like the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, and probably the agencies that fund the work of ASBMR members? So I mentioned fiscal year 2022 because technically for the federal government, 2022 has already begun. In fact, it began on October 1 of 2021. And right now, all federal agencies, including NIH, are operating under what's called a continuing resolution, also called a CR. And what that is a temporary budget agreement that literally keeps the lights on at the federal agencies and allows the federal agencies to remain open, even though they do not have a new budget for the new fiscal year. This current CR expires on December 3rd of 2021. And I'll talk about what the outlook is beyond December 3rd. And unfortunately, though, when an agency like NIH is operating under a CR, it means that their spending, their budget is frozen at the current year level. So in this case, fiscal year 2021. This is really hard on an agency like NIH, whose one of their big functions is to issue research grants to the community and to fund the biomedical research. So under this CR, NIH cannot issue any new grants. There's a really almost impossible for them to issue new grants. If there was a new program or clinical trial or research study that was supposed to start, it may be held over and it may be delayed because there's no new money. And then the other impact is that agencies really much watch their spending very, very closely. So an agency like NIH, which is in the business of handing out grant funds and distributing grant funds, is going to be very, very cautious about how they spend their money. And if you're an NIH funded investigator right now, you may have already gotten a letter or notification or talked to your program officer who said, okay, because of the CR, we are withholding 10% of the funding that we promised you because we have to keep an eye on our spending. If you had a grant that was reviewed at study section in the last month or two and we're told you got a great score, things are looking good, you probably haven't heard much from your program officer in the last couple of weeks, and you won't hear anything because they can't fund any new research right now. So this is very disruptive for the research community, even for those who currently have NIH funding. Next slide, please. And in terms of the process of where things stand with fiscal year 2022. So the new year has technically started, even though none of the agencies have a budget. That being said, progress has been made in putting together the budgets for 2022 for all these agencies. And the budgets come in the form of these 12 appropriations bills that must be approved by the House and Senate each year. Now, they're supposed to be approved by September 30th. That never happens. And in fact, it probably hasn't happened for about 20 or 25 years. So this summer, both the House and Senate made a little bit of progress towards getting these 12 bills approved. The House did a lot better than the Senate. The House Appropriations Committee, which is responsible for writing those 12 bills and getting them passed, they actually did their job and they passed all 12 bills, I think before the August recess this year. They then took 9 of those 12 bills that were approved by the committee and sent them to the full House for a vote. And in fact, the full House approved 9 of those 12 bills. So they got most of their work done in the House. Those 3 remaining bills that did not get the approval by the full House are still out there, and it's not clear if the full House will actually approve them, but they did get approved by the committee, so they're in pretty good shape. The Senate is a different story. The Senate Appropriations Committee only approved 3 of their bills, and that left 9 undone, so to speak. So what the Appropriations Committee did in the Senate was they released the 9 remaining bills that have not gotten a vote even in the Appropriations Committee and said, these are our recommendations. We're going to put these bills out there, but the Senate is not going to have time to do anything with the appropriations bills. The 3 that were approved by the Appropriations Committee are never going to go to the Senate floor, not anytime this century. And the remaining 9 bills that didn't even get a vote in the committee, they're just out there on the public website of the Appropriations Committee, but they haven't been approved. So there's a lot of work that has not quite yet been done for the appropriations process. However, the work that has been done still counts. Like, we'll give them partial credit, and it does set up Congress to eventually reach an agreement. So next slide. So of the bills that FASEB tracks that fund the majority of the research agencies, this is the status. So for agriculture research, the House actually passed that bill, and then the Senate got it through the committee. The bill that funds NSF only got through the House committee, and then in the Senate was one of the ones that was released but never considered. The bill that funds the Department of Energy Office of Science and the national labs, if you work with those, that actually passed the House. That was the good news, and this got Senate committee approval. Unfortunately, the bill that funds NIH is sort of in a bit of a limbo. It passed the House, which is great news, but the Senate didn't even get a vote on that in the committee. So it's still in very draft form. And then lastly, the bill that funds the Veterans Research Program, another one that was approved by the full House and actually got approved by the Senate committee. So we have various states of play here for these different bills. But again, they've been released. Some of them have been approved through the full process. So they're still valid, but they're just considered to be in a fairly draft form. Next slide, Anna. So what's in these bills? The key portion of each of these bills is the very specific funding recommendations for the federal agencies that those bills support. So it's another good news scenario for the National Institutes of Health. Both the House and Senate recommended NIH to receive a big increase. There's a slight error in my slide, which I discovered about 5 minutes before this webinar. But so the House recommendation for NIH was $46.4 billion, a $3.5 billion increase over the current funding level. Now that $3.5 billion is just for what we call the NIH-based budget. It does not include separate funding for ARPA-H, which I'll talk about later. The Senate total recommendation for NIH was $47.9 billion. So the Senate figure in this chart actually does include the ARPA-H funding. And the Senate assigned about $2.4 billion for ARPA. So the Senate's overall recommendation for the NIH-based budget was about $2.5 billion above the current level. So the House did a little bit better, the Senate, which is not totally unusual. NSF, the funding recommendations were almost the exact same. And there's very little daylight between the House and Senate recommendations for the Department of Energy Office of Science. As you can see in the USDA, or the Department of Agriculture, you'll see on the VA research program, the House was far more generous than the Senate. So these are the numbers that are right now out there for consideration. And in fact, as Congress gets towards the process of trying to finish up these bills, I think these numbers are pretty good in the sense that the final numbers for each agency will likely wind up somewhere between the numbers that you see on this chart, between the low end and the high end. I just don't know where right now, and I'll explain why. Hannah, next slide. So what happens next? So the biggest thing that's preventing Congress from reaching an agreement on these appropriations bills and actually finishing the budget for 2022 is that they don't have consensus on what are called the top line spending levels for fiscal year 2022. So each year, the Congress and through the Appropriations Committee must decide how much money they're going to allocate for discretionary spending. What's the total? And that's usually a little over a couple $1 trillion in some cases. And the fight this year, as it's been for the last couple of years, is, well, how much of the total is going to the defense budget and how much is going to everything else, i.e. non-defense? And NIH and Department of Energy Office of Science and the National Science Foundation all fall on the non-defense side. So that's the number that FASEB cares about. Complicating factors this year is that for the last 10 years, there's something been in place called the Budget Control Act, which sets strict limits each year on how much could go towards defense and how much towards non-defense. So there were handcuffs on how much Congress could spend. So I guess the good news is there are no handcuffs this year in terms of how much Congress can spend. The bad news is that since they don't have an agreement, they have yet to figure out a way to get to a consensus on these numbers. And they absolutely cannot move forward to finish these appropriations bills until they get that agreement on what's the maximum limit for defense and what's the maximum limit for non-defense. And that is the big fight right now. The other sort of factor that's kind of floating like a cloud over the Appropriations Committee right now is the rising concerns about the debt and deficit, because there's been so much other congressional spending. So let's not forget, earlier this spring, there was yet another package of relief related to COVID, which was great. Congress just passed an infrastructure bill that's going to cost $1.75 trillion. And then the big elephant in the room is, how much is this reconciliation package going to cost? So people are pretty nervous about setting, top line spending levels on the appropriation side until a couple other things shake out. Once the Appropriations Committee leadership reaches this consensus on these top line numbers, the ultimate limit for defense and non-defense, then they need to figure out how they're going to finish their work. Like I said, they've started the process with drafting these bills that have gone through different phases of the approval process, but they will have to ultimately negotiate every single one of those bills so that they have the exact same amount of funding for each agency. The most likely outcome, because of where we are in the year and how late it is that they will not even make an attempt to pass all 12 of those bills. They will simply go through a process where they take all 12 of the bills and they patch them together into something called an omnibus appropriations bill. It's one of those bills that you read about in the news that's 5,000 pages that people don't read, etc. But that is the most likely path forward, is at some point they will put together all 12 of these bills into one enormous package. Once they do that, that omnibus bill absolutely must go to the House floor and the Senate floor and be approved. And then it would go to the White House for the president's signature. The amount of time it takes to put together an omnibus bill depends. Typically, it's 4 to 6 weeks once they get an agreement on those top line numbers and they start to negotiate the levels for each individual program. So it's not a quick process at all, even though the appropriations committees have done the preliminary work to put out these draft recommendations. Next slide. So here's where I have to take the webinar in a slightly darker direction, and that is, we have no idea when this is going to happen. The outlook right now is just really, really unclear. As I noted, Congress is very distracted by the fact that that reconciliation bill has not been approved yet, and that seems to be everybody's priority right now. We know that even though December 3rd is a little less than a month away, that's in real time. On Capitol Hill time, a month is like 3 years. They will deal with this when it gets closer to December 3rd. We know that another CR is inevitable. They're just not going to get anything done by December 3rd. So the questions are, will there be a government shutdown? Because if Congress does not pass another CR on or before December 3rd, then the government will shut down because there's no temporary budget agreement in place. I really do not believe that we will see a government shutdown this year. The government shutdowns are terrible for everybody. They're a waste of time and energy and money. It is possible, depending on how things go, what kind of mood people are in as we get closer to December 3rd. But the more likely outcome here is that you'll probably see Congress pass another CR on or before December 3rd. It might be really short, 10 to 15 days to get them to maybe December 15th or 20th. That will be another artificial deadline that they have no intention of meeting. They will not be able to make that kind of progress. But what it will do is set up a process by where they do put a date certain on when they want to get these bills passed. What we're hearing this week is that, given the trajectory of where things are going and the timing and everything else and the holidays, it is likely that the government will be run on a CR probably until early March, possibly, or sorry, early February, possibly early March of 2022. So we will not see Congress finish the 22 budget until probably about February or March, which will be at that time 5 to 6 months late, which is not good for an agency like NIH, and it's really not good for the research community. I'm hopeful that if they get an agreement on those top line spending numbers before or around December 3rd, we could accelerate that process and maybe get things done in January. But again, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks to put together an omnibus appropriations bill. So the sooner Congress gets an agreement on those top line spending numbers, the faster they can finally approve the 2022 budget, which will be good for everybody. The next slide. So even though we don't have a path forward to finish up 2022 yet, we absolutely have to start thinking about fiscal year 2023, which seems pretty crazy. But President Biden's 2023 budget request is due to Congress in early February. Now, it is very possible that the Biden administration will delay releasing that budget because they haven't resolved 2022 yet. We don't know. In fact, we've heard nothing about the outlook for 2023 because people can't even figure out how to finish up 2022. Even though the law says President Biden must submit a budget request to Congress the first Monday in February, nothing bad happens to him if that budget request isn't submitted. So what happens will really depend on a couple of different things. Congress is really bad about trying to focus on 2 budget years at the same time. So it's unlikely that they'll be working on 2022 and 2023 in parallel. More likely is that the consideration of the 2023 appropriations bills, which should start around March of 2022, will be delayed because in March of 2022, we will still be talking about the bills that are now 6 months late from the prior year. So even if President Biden's budget is submitted on time for 2023, Congress will likely ignore it and just say, we'll get to this after we finish 2022. Much like for 2022, there's no agreement on the top line funding levels for fiscal year 2023. There is a very slim chance that cooler heads will prevail on Capitol Hill over the next couple of weeks, and they will reach an agreement on the top line funding levels for both 2022 and 2023. There's a little bit of precedent for that. It would actually be a very good thing for the research community if they got an agreement on the 2023 top line spending levels this year, because it will smooth the process over and allow things to go a little bit better next spring. But we are also going to be running into the calendar buzzsaw next year, which is the midterm elections, as I mentioned in November. Midterm elections always equal lots of recess time, meaning that members of Congress are not in Washington to vote on things very often. So that will leave very little time for Congress to work on those 2023 spending bills. And I can tell you this right now, and I can make this bet with a 100% assurance, federal agencies will absolutely start fiscal year 2023 under another CR. So on October 1, 2022, which is actually the first day of fiscal year 2023, the agencies will once again be under a CR, which means it is really, really important for Congress to wrap up the 2022 budget process sometime between now and next spring, hopefully sooner rather than later, so that the agencies can get their money and start getting new research grants out the door, new clinical trials, that kind of thing. Hannah, sorry, next slide. And then I wanted to wrap up today by addressing something that Dr. Ducey mentioned, which is this new idea that is being put forward by President Biden, which is the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, or ARPA-H. This was a signature initiative of his 2022 budget request to Congress. I think as noted in the introduction, the president requested $6.5 billion for this new entity to be spent over a 3-year period. If you've worked at all with the Department of Defense, you may have heard of something similar called DARPAH, or the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. ARPA-H is loosely modeled off of what the DARPAH model. And the whole idea behind ARPA-H is to create a new federal entity that can fast track very promising biomedical research. So, and it's really going to be targeted towards research that is intended to bridge that gap between a basic fundamental finding or outcome and then commercial research and development. How do we get new products to the pharmacy shelf? How do we get new diagnostic tests on the market? And the idea is that ARPA-H will fund some of this risky research where we don't know the outcome, and where someone takes a big chance and says, I think this idea works, or I think this hypothesis is worth exploring. One of the interesting things about DARPA is it's a model that encourages failure, in the sense that if your research doesn't pan out, nothing bad happens to the researcher. You just take the lesson learned and then move on to the next proposal. Right now, there's a lot of information swirling around about ARPA-H, but not a lot of concrete detail. Even President Biden's budget proposal didn't have a lot of detail about what this ARPA-H agency would do or how it would be organized or structured. The Biden administration would like ARPA-H to be connected to NIH because of the work that NIH does, but they also want it to function as a very distinct entity with an independent culture and organization, so that this ARPA-H agency can fund the research that NIH wouldn't necessarily fund. This also includes a separate peer review process to review proposals to be funded by the agency. We don't know much about what that separate peer review process would be because the administration has not put out any details. And then the big issue that's been, I think, for the biomedical research community is, how is ARPA-H going to be funded? And there's a lot of agreement that it really needs to be separate, that this new entity needs its own budget, and the budget should not come from NIH, and it should not come at the expense of NIH. That you still need to provide $40+ billion a year to NIH to fund the fundamental biomedical research that is the hallmark of that agency. So funding for ARPA-H will require new funding to ensure that it does not eat away at the NIH budget. So the Biden proposal for ARPA-H is one of 3 that's pending right now. So it's very interesting that people are talking about this concept and everybody has a slightly different idea of how it's going to work. So next slide, please. So President Biden's budget had some level of detail. And actually, the most detailed proposal for ARPA-H is not coming from the president, but it's actually coming from a member of Congress. So Representative Anna Eshoo, a Democrat from California, last month introduced the first bill that tries to put on paper what ARPA-H is going to be. So this bill would authorize $3 billion in funding for ARPA-H in 2022 as a separate stream with its own budget, so it does not impact the NIH budget at all. The legislation specifies the parameters for deciding on which projects ARPA-H would fund. It puts ARPA-H under the Department of Health and Human Services on the federal organizational chart. So that's the separation from NIH. NIH is also under the Department of Health and Human Services, so they would sort of work together under the same parent agency. Interestingly, the Eshoo proposal requires that the ARPA-H director be a presidential appointment for a limited 5-year term with the ability to serve a second 5-year term. And the thinking behind this is that you need someone who's very creative and energetic. And if you have someone who serves too long as the ARPA-H director, the ideas might get stale or stagnant. In this case, the ARPA-H director would report directly to the HHS secretary. So that's, again, that independence from NIH. But it does require, this bill does require ARPA-H to coordinate with NIH and other federal agencies so that they aren't duplicating the same research, but really advancing new ideas. And then the other thing that this Eshoo proposal does, which is very interesting, is it establishes what they're calling an ARPA-H Interagency Advisory Committee. And that, my understanding, is to ensure that there's coordination between ARPA-H and the other agencies that are funding biomedical and biological research. This proposal that was introduced by Representative Eshoo has 28 supporters right now. They're all Democrats, so it's not bipartisan yet. And about slightly more than a dozen stakeholder organizations have come out and said, we really like this idea, this proposal for ARPA-H. FASEB has not taken a position on this yet because we're waiting for something else to happen. And that's, next slide. So there's actually a third proposal, and that's being expected to be offered by Representatives Diana DeGette from Colorado and Fred Upton from Michigan. This is a bipartisan proposal, and Representatives DeGette and Upton have been working together on this for months. Earlier this summer, they released what they were calling a discussion draft, which was a very rough outline of this ARPA-H concept. Interestingly, it just it put a placeholder. It said insert text for ARPA-H here. So they didn't really outline what this agency would do or provide a lot of detail. What they did do was issue a request for stakeholder input. You know, what does the biomedical research community think about this? How do we think ARPA-H should be organized and funded? So FASEB actually sent a letter to representatives to get an Upton, sharing some kind of high level thoughts of what we think should happen. We are awaiting the complete text of the actual to get Upton ARPA-H legislative proposal, the exact language, which is supposed to be released literally any day now. Every time someone asks, they're like, it's coming soon. So that will be interesting to compare what to get an Upton put together for ARPA-H to Representative Eshoo's bill, and then the White House's vision for ARPA-H. So all of this is kind of also swirling out there, and we don't know what's going to happen. We do know that there is a lot of support for ARPA-H, both among members of Congress, and of course, the Biden administration has made this one of their big requests for Capitol Hill. So I do think at some point next year, we're going to see ARPA-H get off the ground. It's not clear to me yet where the funding is going to come from. So next slide, please. As noted, you know, the president requested $6.5 billion. Well, neither the House nor the Senate has recommended $6.5 billion for ARPA-H. They're not willing to provide that much money for the new entity. The House included $3 billion in new funding for ARPA-H in the bill that funds NIH, and then the Senate included $2.4 billion. So as you can see, Congress right now is only willing to give up about half of the money that was requested by the president. And future funding for ARPA-H, no matter where it happens, even if their funding for ARPA-H is ultimately included in the fiscal year 2022 omnibus appropriations bill that funds NIH, my guess is that it will be frozen until they can actually get a corresponding law passed that establishes ARPA-H, because ARPA-H needs what's called an official authorization to exist because it's a new agency. So if you think back to when the Department of Homeland Security was created, you've got to have a bill that creates ARPA-H before you can fund it. So even if there's funding in the appropriations bills for 2022, they likely won't release that until you get some kind of authorization for ARPA-H. So I think, you know, we will see something happen next year on ARPA-H. And then last but not least, one more thing that I just want to make sure folks are aware of that is going to have an impact, I think, on the future. So next slide. That is, in case you missed it, last month, Francis Collins announced his intent to step down as director of the NIH. So he's not leaving entirely. He's going to go back to his lab at the National Human Genome Research Institute, but he's leaving his stressful job as director of NIH. So the NIH director is a presidential appointment that will require confirmation by the Senate. So Dr. Collins' replacement is going to have to go for a vote in front of the full Senate. Right now, it is not clear when President Biden will nominate a new NIH director. The rumor mill suggests that we will not hear anything until early 2022. Among other things, the Food and Drug Administration does not have a current director, and there's a lot of people who've been pressuring the White House to get the FDA director approved first, because we are still in a pandemic. Regardless of when that nomination is put forward, it's critical that we get the new NIH director confirmed in the Senate before the midterm elections, like really by the beginning of next summer. Otherwise, I worry about what happens to the agency. They'll have an acting director. We don't know who that's going to be right now. It will likely be someone from the inside, but it makes it really hard when there's an acting director at an agency. And I can say this with authority that the White House is reaching out to stakeholders to help identify potential candidates, because FASEB got an email last week from the Office of Presidential Personnel. I think that's just I think they're reaching out to kind of make sure that they really source names from as many people as possible, but I would find it very hard to believe that the White House does not have a short list of potential candidates for the new NIH director. And so FASEB is not actually recommending any names because we're going to have to work with that person regardless of who it is. That being said, we did encourage the White House to think a bit outside the box, i.e. the next NIH director should be someone from a diverse community. It does not have to be someone who looks like Dr. Collins. That being said, it also has to be someone who has the management experience to run a $47 billion a year agency, and also have enough bipartisan support that nomination can get through the Senate. I don't think you're going to see the White House nominates someone who's very controversial who won't be approved by the Senate, because that would be crazy. That being said, until we have a name, it's all a big question mark. So I will stop there. Because ASBMR is a FASEB member, you guys have access to all kinds of advocacy materials on the FASEB website, which I encourage you to take a look at when you get a chance. And then, of course, if you really want to know what's happening, we do keep our social media channels pretty much up to date. So anytime there's breaking news, we will certainly put that out on Twitter. So I will stop there, and I can see that there's some questions, I think, already, and things in the chat.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, for that really informative presentation. We will definitely get to questions after my quick update regarding the Dexa legislation in the current Congress. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Miller, ASBMR Operations Coordinator and Staff Liaison to the ASBMR Advocacy and Science Committee. I'm here to just provide a quick update regarding HR 3517 and S 1943, the Dexa legislation in the current Congress. So this legislation was introduced in May 2021 in conjunction with National Osteoporosis Month. These bills will improve access to Dexa testing by setting a minimum Medicare reimbursement for office-based Dexa tests at $98. Currently, we have 51 co-sponsors of the House bill, HR 3517, and 12 co-sponsors for the Senate bill, S 1943. But as ASBMR advocates, as all of you attendees are, we need you to take action. We need you to email your member of Congress today to co-sponsor this really important legislation. We have a dedicated webpage under the advocacy section on the ASBMR website, where you can check for the co-sponsors for each of the bills, and a hyperlink is there to send an email directly to your elected official's office. This hyperlink is an email template that has a lot of information kind of pre-populated, but you can go in and edit it yourself. And there are also opportunities for you to use Twitter and Facebook to send a message via social media channels to your elected officials. It's very important for you to take action because a high number of co-sponsors is what's needed to get this bill over the finish line and passed and made into law. So now we will turn it over to questions. It seems like we have already a few questions in the Q&A. Patricia, if you want to assist with the Q&A, that would be wonderful. So we have two already.
Anna, I just want to add one quick thing about what you said regarding the Dexa Bill. So it's a clear example, and this you can state in the emails that hopefully you will be sending. It's a clear example of bipartisan support, because out of the 51, and we have 9 more pending actually. So out of the 60, there is 28 Republicans that signed up for this bill in the House, and in the Senate, we have actually 13, and 5 Republicans signed in. So, and we even have Kirsten Sinema. So it's really an achievement in terms of being a bipartisan bill, and this is something that you can state in your emails. So regarding the questions, we have 2 questions in the Q&A. Jenna Lesser asks for Jennifer, who are the stakeholders that would help identify potential NIH directors?
So I can tell just because we got the email from the White House that they're reaching out to the scientific professional societies and the groups who support NIH. So think like FASEB, they may actually get to ASBMR sooner rather than later. I suspect that they are also reaching out to the universities and the research centers and the independent research centers that also are big champions of funding for NIH. And my guess is they're probably reaching out to people in the patient community as well too. You know, one of the things that Dr. Collins is known for is his work on cystic fibrosis. And so they're probably reaching out to the cancer groups and the Alzheimer's groups and the multiple sclerosis and lupus and those groups to say, who do you think would be a good NIH director, since so much of the research that NIH funds supports improving health for all Americans, and especially those with the diseases and things like that. They may actually be reaching out to former administrations, you know, reaching out back out to President Obama, like since it was Obama who nominated Dr. Collins to be NIH director. So it's probably a fairly wide sort of group that they're reaching out to these days. And my guess is, again, they probably have a list of individuals that they're considering, but they want to make sure that they leave no stone unturned and that they're considering people who would be a good NIH director. I have been asked, do I think it's going to be someone who currently works at NIH? And I do not think that will be the case. I think they will actually go outside, in part because, you know, one of the things that Dr. Collins said when he announced that he was stepping down is that it's time for some new leadership and some new thinking. So I do not think it'll be anybody who currently works at NIH.
Thank you, Jennifer. We have another question for you from FASEB. How long will it take for the DARPAH bill to pass if it passes?
It actually could move fairly quickly because since there's the two competing proposals that I mentioned, the one from Representative Eshoo and the forthcoming from Representatives DeGette and Upton, my understanding is that DeGette and Upton and Eshoo have engaged in this process so they could get legislation introduced fairly quickly that could then be attached to something else or get voted on pretty fast once they reach an agreement. So I'm not sure how things will shake out in the end, but it's entirely possible that they'll have some kind of a negotiated version of the ARPA-H proposal that will have been written by Eshoo and DeGette and Upton together, and then they'll just have language ready to go and they'll attach it to something else. They could put it in the omnibus appropriations bill if they wanted to. They could attach it to another bill that has absolutely nothing else to do with ARPA-H. So I think once they kind of get an overall agreement on the structure and how ARPA-H will operate, things will move fairly quickly. Again, because the appropriators really want to fund this new agency. So they just need to get the proposal tightened up. And so they know, you know, who the likely director will be, where ARPA-H will be located, that kind of thing. But I do think it's the kind of thing that could happen sooner rather than later.
I have another question about this, and actually about also advocating for the NIH budget. At this point in the game, how useful is it to advocate now? Are they just bargaining within each other about who is going to get what? Or can we just make have an impact on negotiations?
And I think that's an excellent question. So the truth of the matter is that there's a lot of support for NIH on Capitol Hill, and the appropriators know that because they haven't finished the budget, you know, NIH is suffering because of this. And in fact, if you ask them, they'd probably say, well, one of the primary reasons we need to get the budget finished is so we can fully fund NIH. So you're preaching to the choir if you say them, but NIH doesn't have its final funding level yet. What I do think is a good message is to encourage them to work together to reach this agreement on these top line funding levels so that they can go ahead and finish the process. So they can figure out whether or not NIH is going to get a $3 billion increase this year or $3.5 billion or something in between. I have heard that Senator Roy Blunt, who is the top Republican on the Appropriations Committee that funds NIH in the Senate, believes that the NIH funding level should be higher than what his own committee recommended. He thinks the House number is better. He thinks that there should be, you know, closer to a $3 billion increase for NIH in 2022. And I don't think he's a minority opinion on that. So things are looking good. It's just a matter of just encouraging them that they've got to get this agreement on these top line numbers so they can keep moving forward. So they are kind of negotiating with themselves right now. And they know that, you know, one of the big prizes is if they can get this agreement on top lines, then they can settle what the increase for NIH is going to be. And it's going to be probably a couple of $1 billion, you know, compared to the current level of funding. So, you know, you don't beat them up for the fact that they haven't finished the NIH budget, encourage them to move forward, thank them, and just say, we love the idea of another multi-billion-dollar increase for NIH. And, you can also offer, how can I help make that happen? Who do I need to talk to? Who's the holdup here? That kind of thing. One thing I will say is there's starting to be some rumors that Congress might give up and actually not pass appropriations bills for 2022. I don't think that's really a grave threat, because it would mean flat funding everything at the 2021 level, including the Department of Defense. And neither Democrats nor Republicans want to do that. And the other thing too is that, they will be accused of extending the Trump budget, because the budgets that were approved for 2021 were actually signed into law by then President Trump. And I don't think the Democrats, who are in charge of now all three branches of government, are at the end of the day going to be like, yeah, what's good for us? The Trump budget. So I do think that you'll see some bipartisan cooperation sometime in the next couple of weeks, because the reality of failure is much greater than just, it's worth fighting for another couple of weeks to get this agreement, because the huge embarrassing failure, if they don't, it has wide-ranging implications.
Patricia, I can handle the question in the inbox, and also Doug had sent me a question for Jennifer. So Jennifer, in light of the delay in approving the FY 2022 budget and in turn the FY 23 budget, what's your opinion on an optimal time next year for a Hill Day?
Yes.
Or for an ASBMR Hill Day?
Okay. I'm going to go with the very bold prediction that I usually go with, which is March, April. So you can't go wrong with having a Hill Day in March and April for two reasons. One, worst case scenario, we have not finished the 2022 budget yet. So it gives you a chance to do that last minute advocacy to push that number as high as possible for NIH in 2022. Best case scenario, they did wrap up 2022 and they're ready to start on FY 2023. So I think in that March, April timeframe, you can't go wrong. The big question is, are you talking about the 2022 budget or the 2023 budget, or heck, make it difficult, talk about both. You could probably, if you really wanted to focus on the fiscal year 2023 budget, you could extend that out to maybe the May-June period. It just really kind of depends on where things stand. Like I said, things are looking up for a multi-billion-dollar increase for NIH for 2022. You don't want to leave anything on the table, and you don't take anything for granted. So doing a Hill Day in March, April is probably not a bad idea. But again, you could push it to May, June if you really wanted to.
Well, that's great advice, and we really appreciate it. Thanks so much, Jennifer. We have a I thought you were going to say something. Go ahead and continue. We have a question here regarding the Dexa legislation that I would be happy to handle. What is the feeling? The question is, what is the feeling regarding passage of the Dexa bill this year realistically? I know it says here we've been working on this for a number of years. So, that's a great question. Again, these two bills are viable till the end of 2022 when before the new Congress from the 2022 midterms are elected. And so I think what Jen relayed about ARPA-H about including bills in other packages or with other bills, I think that's probably the most likely scenario with the Dexa legislation that I presented. And but our goal and our immediate action is to get those co-sponsors so it can be considered to pass, whether it is in a package or whether it is in another bill. So thank you so much for your question.
Jennifer, in your experience with that kind of numbers where we are about between 51 and 60 supporting in the House and about 13 in the Senate, what are the odds?
So, I've been doing this a long time. The general sort of rule of thumb with trying to get co-sponsors for bills and things like that is in the House, you want to get over 100. Getting over that 100 co-sponsor mark is really considered to be a good milestone. And then you kind of try and keep going from there. In the Senate, everyone past 50 makes it easier to pass a bill in the Senate, because remember, it takes 60 votes to pass almost everything in the Senate these days. So in the Senate, you want to strive towards 50 and then keep adding beyond that if you can. I will say that the process of getting co-sponsors is it's a lot of work. It's tedious. I mean, you have to email and you have to talk to each congressional office multiple times, even offices that may have supported the bill previously. There's just so much legislation that's introduced on Capitol Hill each year that it's very easy to miss that. And it's very easy for even the same person that the aide that you may have talked to a year ago and who said, oh yes, my boss would love to support your bill, and then signs them on as a co-sponsor, forgets or gets busy doing something else. So it's a relentless march towards continuing to get co-sponsors and pestering each congressional office to say yes, to get to yes, that kind of thing. And don't be afraid to enlist advocates from other states as well too. This is not something that you, Dr. Ducey, have to do on your own. Reach out to your fellow researchers and your collaborators in other states and say, could you do me a favor and spend 5 minutes and just send off this email? And while it may not seem like it makes a difference, it really does. The more times you contact a congressional office, the more aware they're going to be of your issues, of who you are, and you can eventually get them to say yes to co-sponsors. So now is a really good time when it seems like appropriations are just hopelessly frozen in gridlock and you've got a lot of excess energy. Start lining up co-sponsors for that Dexa bill.
So the message here is we should send as many emails as we can. And as a matter of fact, if you want to check whether your representatives are or not co-sponsoring this bill, you have a web page on the ASBMR that is updated regularly, and you will see exactly who's supporting and who can be persuaded maybe a little bit further to support the bill.
Yes, absolutely. Please check before you email an office and ask them to co-sponsor bill, because it doesn't look great when you ask them to do something they've already done.
Yeah, and that link has been provided in the chat. So it's very easy. It's just right in the chat. And
when they do say yes, do them a solid and say thank you. A quick tweet thanking them or sending them in a follow-up email. So thank you so much for doing this. They're not, members of Congress don't get thanked very much. So remember to thank them when they do co-sponsor the bill.
Yeah. So in any case, email, whether to ask or to say thank you. I think that now concludes today's advocacy update. And I want to thank our panelists, Jennifer Zeitzer and Anna Eshoo, for joining us today. And again, this webinar has been taped and will be available on the ASBMR YouTube page. And I thank all attendees, and I look forward, and we all look forward to your future participation as ASBMR advocates. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye.